I'm Gary Greider, High Performance Computing Division Leader at Los Alamos National Lab. My talk today is going to be about motivations for use of computational storage for high performance computing applications and high performance computing systems. We've been working a little bit in this area, and you probably have seen maybe some press releases about that work. And so this is basically going to cover the motivation for why we're doing that work. I encourage people watching this to put their questions into the chat so that when it's played back, we can answer the questions as they arise. So Los Alamos has been computing for a long time, going back 80 years, from tube systems to the first Cray 1 to the first CM5 connection machine, from thinking machines to the first petaflop machine, Roadrunner, and even all the way to a quantum machine, the D-Wave system that we have. And two more systems coming in the next two years or so, Crossroads and NGP1. And our big machine on the floor right now is Intel, a Cray Intel called Trinity, and I'll tell you a little bit about that as background. Trinity put in 2016. It's still a very large machine from a memory point of view, 2 petabytes of DRAM. You can see the specs, 20,000 nodes and so forth. 4 petabytes of NAND flash at 4 terabytes a second. Was called a burst buffer. It was essentially a ephemeral file system that was built by Cray. 100 petabyte scratch file system that was disk, 1.2 terabytes a second. And then we have this campaign store, which is essentially a cool disk tier for scientific campaigns that last a few years, and you need to keep a lot of data nearby. That actually is more like 100 petabytes now, and like 100 gigabytes a second. And then we have the site-wide parallel tape system. But the next machines that DOE are putting in, starting next year and the following, have closer to 10 petabytes of DRAM and 100 petabytes of flash, and half an exabyte spinning disk. And so these things aren't tier 1 size, but they're really pretty large. And what's interesting about the ones at LANL is that they're used primarily for one job or some small number of jobs. And those jobs run very, very large. So say half of the machine for a year or two to solve a problem, which is pretty unusual. Most DOE HPC sites don't do that. They have thousands of users and hundreds of codes. We have 3 or 4 codes and very few users. And we run these very, very large things. So we're a little bit on the edge from that point of view. So anyway, that's a little bit about the machines. It helps to understand a little bit about the applications and how they work to understand why we might care about computational storage. So first of all, you see these diagrams on the left-hand corner and so forth. The one in the middle at the bottom is a good example. It's an Eulerian AMR. Eulerian means that the mesh stays the same shape roughly, although it might change. The square sizes might change, but it's always squares, or it's always the same shape. And then the application runs, and whatever's happening inside is what's changing. On the left is the Lagrangian method, which is where the mesh deforms to the problem. And so that's a different way to solve problems. There's sort of 2 different approaches. And then there's this thing called AMR, automated mesh refinement, which you can see very well in the middle bottom. You can see that the fun parts, where the red part is, where the cool part of, the interesting part of the simulation, the resolution is smaller. The resolution is higher than the stuff that's further away from the interesting part. And we do that because we're trying to run a problem that's 100 times too big for the machine. 2 petabytes is a big machine, 10 petabytes is a really big machine, but it's still way too small to solve problems at full resolution. So we do these tricks and use sparse representations and AMR and the like to be able to fit the problems onto the machines. And the opportunity here is that, the results from any query that we might do, we probably are only interested in that little red part. or the red and the orange part. And so you can see that that's a tiny part of the whole thing. Of course, it moves around a lot, changes its shape and all that kind of stuff. But any query of any particular time step, we probably don't really need to retrieve much data. And if we could subset it properly, and that represents a really good example of, retrieving small amounts that you write, which, putting reduction techniques near the storage makes a lot of sense. And there's something else that's really interesting about this is each one of those cells, those squares or whatever, polyhedrals, they have like 50 floating points, or 5 to 50 floating point values, like pressure and temperature and so forth. And they also have location, of course, in the mesh. So this thing is very record oriented, even though today we write large files. That's a holdover from when we had disk drives. And so at any rate, there's an opportunity there. So now that you're all computational scientists and understand how to do, physics calculations on big machines, does this really motivate computing near storage or in the network? And here's the way I think about it. It's a lot of data. Petabyte per time step is a lot of data. There's a lot of time steps associated with a calculation. Runs for months and months and months and generates hundreds of petabytes of data. So it's really pretty large. And the data sets themselves are large, petabyte in size. And there's several things. There's several things we think we can use computation in the storage and the network for, but there's two sort of primary areas. One is intensive data management tasks like erasure, encoding, and compression and stuff like that. When you're moving petabytes around, you have to do it very parallel, and it can be pretty costly. And so finding efficiencies there makes a lot of sense. And the other is data analysis. So like I said, when we pull data in today, we pull the whole petabyte in and we find the little red spots for each time step. And if we could somehow, reduce that data before it ever leaves the storage with a query of some kind, that would be a huge win as well. And remember, I said that the data is really records. So we can use that to our advantage. So let's conquer the first one first, which is the data management tasks. So very, intensive data management tasks. Those are data management tasks that don't have to understand what the data is or looks like or its structure. It's just streams of bytes that it cares about. And we call the data agnostic fixed function offloads. And we picked to do a demonstration of a file system offload where we took the erasure, the encoding, and the compression and offloaded it from the application itself, which was a kernel-based file system. And there's a lot of requirements there. You have to have erasure because you need to deal with disaster. It has to be highly parallel because we do things in parallel to move petabytes around, and it's both a read and a write workload. There's not just read or write. And so things that we think we can get benefits from are maybe putting a processor that's more capable of doing passes over the data far more, maybe pipelined passes over the data, like heavy duty compression that uses Huffman tables and the like, or very expensive encoding and decoding and erasure calculations for protecting against data loss. And so the idea is that to drive the cost down of providing these services, these storage services. Where do we want to attack this? Where the real problems are? And what we think the real problems are right now are poor server memory bandwidth. So today, you might think that servers have really, really high memory bandwidth, but they really don't compared to the amount of processing capabilities they have. And really compared to the networks and the storage that you hook up to them, the memory bandwidth is not that high. And so that's the place that we chose to attack the problem. And we decided to offload using ZFS. So we did that, and the idea was to not hide the offloads under block or file, but to actually provide a distributed heterogeneous computing environment where the application ran partly on the host, partly on the NIC in the BOF, the bunch of blocks of flash, and partly in NVMe computational devices. And here's an example of memory bandwidth issues. The dotted lines are, writing to large numbers of NVMe devices and raw, and then if you add compression and erasure and the like, what you see is you get less and less of the max memory bandwidth you can get. And that's just because there's not enough memory bandwidth in servers to pass over the data as many times as you need to and get the throughput that you need. So this is the offload that we did. It's the top box is how ZFS works. It's in kernel file system. You write data. It goes into the kernel. It does all these operations and eventually writes it out to NVMe devices. Instead, we farmed out all those very, memory and memory bandwidth intensive operations down in the green boxes at the bottom to storage accelerators, in the NIC at the BOF or in NVMe devices themselves, and we did it in such a way that it's not hidden under block interface. So, the kernel file system had to be modified. We have a ZFS developer on site, so there's a modified version of ZFS that you can get that does this. It offloads to hardware out in the BOF and writes the stuff out to NVMe, and it only writes the data out to the device once, to the accelerators once, and then it stays there, and then the application just is in control of what the accelerator does, and then the accelerator writes the data out to NVMe devices as peer. So this is a demo. We did a demo with these companies, Identicom with their no-load software. Aon provided engineering of an enclosure to do this. NVIDIA provided BlueField 2 technology and know-how, and SK provided flash storage and know-how, and Lionel did the ZFS offload work and the ZFS kernel layer. This was a recent press release. You can read about it. I'm not going to tell you the details of it. That probably would be better for a SDC talk or something. The next thing that I want to talk about is the other use case, which is data analysis. And this is where, the computational storage has to understand what the data is, it has to understand its structure and type and things like that to be able to do analytics on the data written out to the flash. And so we haven't started a demo of this yet, but we're about to. But we have done some software demonstrations of this. The first one was this particle and cell code. This became a best student paper at Supercomputing. I think it was last year. And it's it's a science code where it has about 1 million cells and about 1 trillion particles, and the cells are spread out across the memories of like 100,000 processes. Particles flow through the cells and enter the cells and leave cells based on energy pushing them around. And so this application runs and does time steps, and every time step the particles have moved around into different cells. And the idea at the end of this long simulation is that 1,000 of the particles are super interesting to the scientist, and the scientist wants to know where they've been, what cells were they in which time steps, and essentially a trace of where they've been. And so we thought about how to do that. And this is kind of a good example of how one might put stuff out near storage. We did this all in software as a prototype, and it's called DeltaFS. You can look it up. There's papers about it. And essentially what we did was, instead of writing files, the application wanted to write 1 file per particle per time step, which would have been 1 trillion particles per time step, which is a lot. We wrote a library, and they thought they were writing files, but they were really writing records to about 10,000 or so level DB instances, or log structured merge tree key value stores. The key was the particle ID, so it sharded perfectly well, and the value, of course, is the other floating point values associated with the particle. And so you see on the bottom left graph that's the overhead of writing the data out. The light blue is writing it out in just big blocks, and then the additional dark blue is the overhead of building the index on the fly on it. And that's the idea, is we don't want to affect the write path very much. We don't have a lot of memory on the compute nodes to use to do anything with. And so it basically kind of all needs to be offloaded. We offloaded it, but it was all in software. And then on the right, you can see the win on query. It was about 1000x. Incredible numbers, like 8 billion particles per second inserts, and the amazingly small amount of data that we actually had to retrieve, because it's only 1000 particles times all the time steps instead of 1 trillion particles times all the time steps. So the win is enormous. This is the kind of thing that is perfect for computational offload, we think. So isn't a 1000x speed up enough? Well, yes, it is, except for the problem is that VPIC problem is pretty simple. It's a single dimensional index that was perfectly shardable because we were using particle ID. But our real problems have higher dimensions to them. They're unstructured. Meshes move around. Remember the AMR and the Lagrangian and Eulerian that I talked about. They're really complex things, and the dimensionality of them requires you to have indexes along more than one dimension, and the dimensions that you might want to index are not all easily shardable. You might want to index on pressure, and pressure is distributed across 500,000 cores memories, and so you've got this key distribution, and you don't know how to shard it. You don't know how to discover how to shard it. That's a pretty hard problem by itself. So at any rate, that's where we want to go with this. And let me give you a little bit of background behind that. So you take a unstructured mesh like this is an Eulerian AMR, and there's several time steps in that green figure. You can see several time steps, and you can see the changes. It's changing every time. And so the first question you got to ask yourself is, how do I even come up with a location key? And the answer to that is it changes every time step, and so there won't be exactly a perfect location shard the sharding will change every time step. The key is not easy. It's not a simple square. It's a set of squares that are inside a set of squares, and so you have to come up with a key structure that works for that, and that's pretty easy. Just use dots, column 1.4 and column 1.4.4 and so forth. You can imagine how you can build a fairly interesting and simple key structure for the location part. But how in the world would you come up with sharding on how hot is the dark red versus how cold is the green or the blue or something, right? That's much harder to do because it's changing all the time, and so anyway, but we would need to have indexes on both of those things to be able to figure out how to know where, say, a shock wave going through a material, you want to follow the front of the shock wave. There's a lot of pressure there. You need to follow the high pressure, but it's moving all the time, and the pressure's changing all the time, and so it's a pretty hard problem. We do think that key value is one of the best ways to go do this because it is record oriented and it exposes the structure of the data. So how would we go? How have we gone about this? Well, we wrote this middleware library, MDHIM, multidimensional hierarchical indexing middleware, and essentially, it's what I talked about before, but kind of on steroids. It's a framework that can link with parallel application and run thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of key value store instances in software. And you can provide sharding information, and it'll start up the key value store instances for you all over the machine, and it will set it up so that when you do puts, it puts to the right shard based on your location in the mesh. And we don't use get and put. We use multi-get, multi-put. Why? Because 1 trillion particles is 1 trillion RPCs, and that's a lot of RPCs even on our networks. And so, ganging them together and using bulk puts and gets makes a lot of sense. It saves you a couple of 3 orders of magnitude in RPCs. Anyway, this framework exists. You can download it, and it does, work. And the idea is that we want to farm, instead of doing this all in software, we'd like for those LSMs or some kind of analytic thing actually be, in the storage itself. But let's talk a little bit about how we figure out how to shard those values that are like pressure. How do you do that? You can't use a bunch of compute node memory. You can't use a bunch of compute node resource to do it because the computer's busy and full. How do you discover what the distribution of the keys look like? Well, it turns out because the way the applications work is they compute and they exchange some information about boundary conditions, and then they compute and they do that again. And then every once in a while, they'll write a dump to storage for checkpoint and restart because something will die and they need to restart. And so anyway, the network gets to see an awful lot of this data. And so if we could train the network to figure out what the distribution looks like, we could just ask the network, hey, what's the distribution of the pressure? And I'll shard it appropriately. And really, that's not terribly hard for the network to do. It can just keep histograms of the pressure. And we can just query all the NICs or all the switches or whatever, and they can tell us what all their histograms are, and we can come up with a decent sharding strategy. So compute in the network actually is interesting. We've already prototyped this with Bluefield 2, and it does kind of work. So how would we go about doing this? Well, today, the way we do it is we shard up the data, and we do it all with software with a key value DB, and we write statistics, histograms, as we write the data. And then, but there's an awful lot of scanning associated with this. It's not very indexed. It's mostly just histograms. And it's all software. And where we really want to go with it is here, where we do the same thing we did with that kernel-based application, ZFS. We want to do it with a user space application using this framework to do analytics on these petabyte size time steps. And we would create the histograms or the indexes on the fly as the data was written in all these shards. And then we could use the indexes or histograms to follow a shock wave or something, that's our hope. And so this work is starting sort of as we speak as the next generation demo. And lastly, how do we think about using computational storage and offloads and functions, and how do you program that? And there's lots of things, right? There's this HXMs. You can write some frameworks or middleware to make it easier for you to program it. There's emerging standards like the NVMe computational storage standard, which we're a member of, and these demonstrations are hopefully going to help them with understanding, how hard it is to do, and whether that standard needs to evolve in some way or not. And you need a different storage paradigm than block. You've got to have a distributed storage paradigm, a distributed programming paradigm for storage, where you do remote mallocs and where you control what the accelerator does from the application, not just send it blocks and have it blindly do things for you. And that's all of our demonstrations have done that. And the lessons learned from like other places, like we in HPC have distributed heterogeneous systems, GPUs and CPUs and other things, and we program them. And there's certainly programming paradigms that live in that space. And there's also programming paradigms from the streaming community, which also have heterogeneous distributed systems as well. So anyway, we think that there's things to be learned from all this to assist in getting us to the point where we can really use these distributed heterogeneous computational offloads in the network and in storage, where we can actually treat them like peer programming units. Anyway, that's the story. That's why we're motivated to do it. And thank you very much for your time. And please take a moment to rate this session. And once again, anything that you put in the chat, we'll try to answer those questions. And then there's, I believe, also a panel, maybe after the next session or the following, and you can ask questions there too. Anyway, thank you very much, and have a good workshop.